Is it possible that the Pope makes a mistake in canonizing someone? There are three answers. The first answer is, the first possible answer, not probable, not definite, but possible. The first possible answer is, the present Pope is not Pope. If I would testify to that fact, a lot of people in this country would go, yoo-hoo, finally Father Hesse sees the light. Well, in their eyes, I still don't see the light, because I agree with St. Antonine of Florence, that even if a Pope preaches heresy, the fact that he's obnoxious in his heresy, which is the only way that he could lose his papacy, the fact that he's obnoxious in his heresy would have to be judged. Now, since the Pope cannot be judged by anyone, this is Canon 333 in the New Code, and it's almost identical wording in the Old Code. Since the Pope cannot be judged, it would have to be the almost full College of Bishops to state that fact. You can imagine, you can do your educated guesses on the probability that the present College of Bishops would do that. So we cannot establish the fact that the Pope is not Pope, because we are not his judge. We can judge his actions, we can judge his words, but we cannot judge his position, because that would be judging him. On an occasion that I cannot possibly define, some people say that John the 23rd never was Pope, and therefore we haven't had a Pope ever since. That, of course, is totally illogical. The conclave, the papal election, is an act of administration, and not a dogmatic happening. And I know all the arguments, like the Cum ex Apostolato, all these bulls and encyclicals, and of course there we are faced with contradictions within church history, because obviously Leo XIII did not believe in the binding value of Cum ex Apostolatus Officio by Paul IV. Paul IV, if you have the time for a close study of the personality of Pope Paul IV, you will find that he was actually, am I talking about, yes, Paul IV, the man from Naples, Paul IV, that he was a maniac. I mean, he really, seriously, I'm not joking about popes of the past. And he was a maniac. And Leo XIII, in his regulation of the papal election, made it pretty clear that this document is not to be taken seriously. So most of the objections against the present Pope being Pope, most of them I say, are simply based on what you call legalism. A rigid and, like most rigid interpretations when you're not talking about dogma, a rigid interpretation of some canons that are not to be applied anymore. Some other theories say that Paul VI ceased to be Pope the moment he signed religious liberty. That, at least, is a lot more profound as an argument, and correspondingly, I've heard it only twice. And then some other people say that we've had popes until Paul VI was kidnapped, and of course this is... And then some people say that John Paul II even was Pope until he had the meeting at Assisi. So what happens is that obviously these experts on who is a Pope and who is not a Pope are capable of substituting the Episcopal College's judgment. I don't believe so, and as long as nobody can prove to me, as long as anybody can prove to me, as long as nobody can prove to me that John Paul II is not Pope, I will formally recognize his papacy, even though there's one thing that one has to understand. First of all, the greatest mistake about the papacy made is to think that the Pope can do everything. The rector of the French seminary in the 1920s, when the later Archbishop Marcel Lefebvre would be studying in that seminary, said that now that Pius X has exposed the viciousness of modernism, we are still facing the worst of all possible heresies. The heresy that the Pope can do anything. I have right here a German translation. So what I'm giving you is basically an English translation of the German translation of a Latin original. So indulge with my lacking infallibility of what I'm doing now. I'll give you the gist of it. I swear not to diminish or change or admit any novelty in the tradition that I have found preserved by my God-willed predecessors. All the more I will be the faithful disciple, the truly faithful disciple, with all of my burning dedication as the successor, and to keep, with all respect, all of my force, all of my efforts, this handed-down treasure. This is a very long sentence, so I beg your pardon if you lose context. Everything that is in contradiction to the canonical order, whatever it may be, to clean. So he's saying, I swear that I will clean everything, clean out, purify everything that is in contradiction to the canonical order. I swear. You always have to remember, it says here, the picture of what you see is that it says, I swear. And then he lists what he's going to swear on, what he's going to testify on, what he's going to promise. To protect as divine instruction all the holy canons and all the instructions of our popes, as if they were divine instruction, as I'm conscious that I, who has your place only through divine grace, that I, who is the vicar of you, that I will have to justify everything I did at the divine judgment. If I should venture to do anything in another sense, or to admit that it is going to be done, then on that terrible day of judgment, you will not be very graceful to me, very gnädig, very indulgent with me. This is the, so to speak, the first part of the papal oath of incoronation. So far, the Pope is speaking about his own person. And so the Pope, already being Pope, is not saying we. He says I. The rest here now is the Pope speaking already as Pope. So he says now we. Therefore, we submit to the excommunication in the most stricted banning whosoever would dare, be it ourselves or somebody else, to introduce anything new in contradiction to this evangelic tradition, to the purity of the Orthodox faith and the Christian religion, or anybody who would, in his contradictory efforts, try to change things, or to withhold the purity of the faith, or to agree with those who do. I understand if you don't understand much of this ad hoc and very lousy translation, but what the Pope actually is saying is that he swears that he's not going to change anything in tradition, that he will accept anything that has been handed down from his predecessors, that he's going to cleanse every contradiction to this tradition, that he's going to safeguard the canons and the instructions of the popes, his predecessors therefore, and that he submits himself to the most harsh judgment by God if he should do something to the contrary. And then, speaking in papal authority, he puts everybody else under the same ban, may it be himself or somebody else. This oath of incoronation is to be found in writing for the first time in church history in 678. I think it was Pope Agatha I. Was Pascal? No, Agatha, I think. And it has been submitted in writing to all the heads of state in Europe. That means the emperors of the Holy Roman Empire of the German nation, and it has been submitted to the kings of France until Boniface VIII, who was Pope until 1303. Boniface VIII, for political reasons, didn't sign this. However, it's still to be found in the Liber Diurnus Romanorum Pontificum. That's sort of the diary of the popes. So this thing here has been signed. Over 600 years it has been signed by the popes, and ever since then it has never been contradicted. This is what you call church tradition. The Pope has to submit to tradition. Therefore, the Pope cannot do everything. Matter of fact, papal authority, ever since people started to misunderstand the infallible definition of infallibility, most people are under the common error of thinking that the Pope can do everything. If the Pope dyes his hair green, you will do so. You will do the same. If the Pope says that you must not eat apples, you won't eat apples. That's not the way it is. The Pope is entirely subject to his predecessors unless you talk about discipline and church government. In matters of faith and moral, he's bound. He's also bound in matters of canonical tradition. Example, the question if a priest may marry or not is certainly a disciplinary question and not a question of faith. And yet, it has been recommended ever since St. Paul, and it is a law for almost 1,000 years now. So a pope could not, in the future, abolish celibacy because it has become part of what you could call the status ecclesiae, the state of the church. In a way like we have the United States Constitution, which unfortunately is step by step done away with, thanks to the recent presidents and you know what. And in the constitution of the church, there are certain things that, while they were only recommended at the beginning, they have become a law long ago, and popes cannot change that. If you think that the Pope can do anything, you will either have to follow him into his heresies, or you will have to declare the see vacant. And since most people have a problem with distinctions and have a problem with complicated answers, they decide for the simple answer, and they will say, for the simplistic answer, I should say. The simple answers usually are true. But they decide for the simplistic answer by saying, oh, we don't have a Pope, and the others say, well, you just got to do what he says. Therefore, I think that this point is not a solution to our question. There is a second possibility of solution, a very, very daring one. Very daring one. And I challenge anyone out there who says that Father Hesse said, I challenge anyone to have to retract publicly and even have to go to court if you claim that what I say now is my conviction. I offer a possibility of solution. I do not say that is the answer. The Church teaches as a certified doctrine, sententia certa, that declarations of sanctity, that means canonizations, are infallible, because in such an important matter, when you talk about somebody being ascribed to the calendar of saints, and very often his veneration being made obligatory. See, that's the difference between beatification. Beatification means you may venerate him. canonization means very often you must venerate him. And it sounds, of course, highly improbable the Church would be capable of forcing the veneration of somebody who is most definitely not a saint on everybody. One could argue that, and that's the reason why I went into such an elaboration to explain the procedure of examining a future saint's life and his miracles. One could argue that since the whole procedure is what you call, it's not evidence and proof, but it's circumstantial proof. You're talking about circumstantial proof. I mentioned the example of Emperor Charles I, when some people in Madeira who were asked if it was actually the novena prayed in honor of the last Austrian emperor would be the cause of their miraculous, cure, or the miracle that cured the bone cancer. They would say, well, yes, Father, but you see, at the same time, I was saying 3 rosaries instead of 1. And then, of course, he would say, okay, was it Our Lady who did the intercession, or was it the emperor? You have circumstantial evidence. It would be much easier if you're faced with something that a whole village, the parish priest publicly announces that the whole village is going to say a novena in the honor of St. Charles, Emperor of Austria, in order to have the child of Mrs. Schmalzhuber being cured of its bone cancer. And on the 9th day of the novena, the child suddenly is cured. See, this is something that you would easily consider as evidence. But mostly things are more complicated. And whenever you face the final papal approval that, yes, his life was a saintly life, and very obviously he must have been the one whose intercession we have to thank for as regards the 2 miracles confirmed, we are lastly dealing with circumstantial evidence. Obviously, the Holy Spirit can give his inspiration and his sort of guarantee also for the results of circumstantial evidence. Yet, somebody could argue and say there have been cases when something that had the status of certified doctrine of sententia certa later on was contradicted. I don't know of any case, but there might be an argument. Possibly one could say, well, we have to face the fact that canonizations are not infallible. I am not saying that. I believe that canonizations are infallible, so I do not accept solution 1 and I do not accept solution 2. Solution 3 is, in my eyes, the most understandable. How can a pope, whether he's pope or not, because he has universal power, but he's not omnipotent. There are many things the Pope has no right to decide about. And there are many things that the Pope will vitiate his own decision if he does it under certain circumstances. The Pope most definitely sort of revolutionized the procedure for the causes of saints. He abolished the devil's advocate. He did not admit contrary testimony in some of the cases that he had to deal with. Doesn't matter if it was him or some official in the Roman Curia. The Pope is always responsible for everything that happens in the Roman Curia. And so you could say, because of a defective procedure, he cannot come to a decision. And because of his defective procedure, and because of that he cannot come to a definite answer, he cannot pronounce an infallible judgment, even though it sounds like it. That's another solution. It's a possible solution. I think it's even probable, and yet I'm still not satisfied with it. It might as well be a combination of both. That on one hand, the way the Pope has changed the procedure for examination of the life of the saint, the way the Pope has changed the procedure of discussion, will invalidate any attempt to canonize or beatify anyone, in which case even the case of Padre Pio would have to be re-examined. I firmly believe in the validity of the case of Padre Pio, but if the cause is vitiated, the procedure is vitiated, a future Pope, for the sake of formality, will have to redo the canonization of, or confirm the canonization of Padre Pio, whom, my very good friend and whom I consider a very reliable source on Padre Pio, Father Gruner, said that he most firmly believes in the authenticity of the case of Padre Pio. Doesn't keep me from thinking that a future Pope will have to explicitly, formally confirm that sanctification, the canonization. And then there's another thing. We have said that the formula of canonization only means the man is in heaven. Does not mean that he has lived a saintly life. Is that possible? Yes, of course it's possible. Remember John Wayne? John Wayne certainly was not the most shining example of a heroic, virtuous Catholic life, and yet he died with all the sacraments. Do you remember the fact that extreme unction is, if there is an act of contrition, extreme unction will confer a plenary indulgence? Doesn't a plenary indulgence mean that you die without temporal punishment? Doesn't that mean that if somebody, even if he lived a less than Catholic life, on his deathbed receives all of the sacraments, including extreme unction, and that very moment dies without a bad thought? Let's say he receives extreme unction, he's sorry for his sins because they offended Christ. Why would he otherwise want the priest on his deathbed? Unless it's for mere speculation. And then he dies without another sin because he keeps praying his Our Father, and that moment he dies. Wouldn't he go to heaven without purgatory? Impossible, some people say, because some people think that God's mercy is impossible, obviously. But it's quite possible that that happens. In that case, the man could be validly canonized, but he could be validly canonized, yes. He could be validly inscribed, infallibly inscribed, in the list of people who are in heaven. But this is not an act in accordance with the tradition of the Church. It's something that you call, in German you call that a nicht-kirchliche Handlung, a non-church action, a non-ecclesiastical action. Meaning, the term doesn't, in the proper sense, doesn't exist in English, meaning that, yes, the Pope makes an infallible pronouncement, but he does it under circumstances that are most definitely against the interests of the Church, against the tradition of the Church, and against the economy of salvation in the Church. Because it's kind of like saying publicly, oh, don't worry about your sins. Just make sure you make an act of contrition before you die. You might not have time for that act of contrition before you die. If you're run over by a bus, you might be thinking some very vicious thoughts until you are gone. No act of contrition here. So that's, of course, that's vicious. Very vicious. And you see, I do not believe in these simplistic, rationalistic answers saying, he makes a mistake, he's not Pope. Or, he makes a mistake, well, in that case I have to say, canonizations are not infallible. That's a sort of, it's an argumentation by exclusion. You ain't black, so you're white. What about your being gray? Nah, you ain't white, so you're black. You ain't black, so you're white. It's not a yes, therefore it's a no. Where's the distinctions? St. Thomas Aquinas says, distinguendum est, distinguendum est, distinguendum est. You should read the Summa Theologiae. Talk about Jesuits answering a question with a question. You should read the Summa Theologiae, where St. Thomas in his answer says, yes, 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 but. I answer with a yes, and then I say, but. This has to be considered such and such and such. From another viewpoint, though, you have to remember such and such and such. So under the first circumstance, yes. Under the second circumstance, no. This is the common answer given in the old days by the Holy Office. You ask the Holy Office, may I, under such circumstances, do this and this and this? The Holy Office will answer, if circumstance A is present, yes. If circumstance B is present, no. That's a yes and no answer. Yes and no. It's a yes and no answer. And the same is true with most theological solutions. They are simple, yes, but they're not simplistic. They're not black and white. You're not talking about a theological chessboard. You're talking about a digital picture. You're talking about something that has all shades of color. And still it is simple. I think that the answer is, if somebody who has led a vicious life, but who most probably was torn in between frequenting the sacraments, and as far as the founder of the Opus Dei or John the 23rd are concerned, celebrating Mass, administering the sacraments, not giving up. At the same time, unlike a certain Secretary of State in the past, who sent away the priest on his deathbed, receiving the priest on his deathbed, receiving the last rites, dying, feeling sorry for his sins, even though he had a somewhat less precise picture about his sins than God will have, and then dying, let's say, as the last one, who just by the skin of his teeth escapes hell and goes into purgatory, and then he's got a whole bunch of bishops and popes and priests who celebrate masses for him. Now, are there in plenary indulgences or are there not? Is a plenary indulgence a gallon of gas for a truck, or what? Or is a plenary indulgence filling it? Plenary means full. A full indulgence. Plenary indulgence means all punishment is taken away. Why wouldn't it be possible that then a man who has led a vicious life, but for some reason felt sorry for his sins before he died, he would go to heaven? Yes, but it would be a vicious act to propose him as an example. That's why you will not find the Mass of St. Constantine, Emperor, in the Roman Missal. Though we all believe that he's in heaven. But he was not exactly the most perfect example on how to reach sanctity. See, the Church knows an economy of salvation. Economy of salvation, not in the financial sense, obviously, but economy is a somewhat larger and greater and bigger term than the term money. And the economy of salvation means you do not give people their favorite person as saint, but you give them their favorite saint as an example. You show them, okay, not everybody can imitate St. Francis of Assisi. I mean, in my case, forget it. I'll never be like St. Francis of Assisi. So I need some other example. One of my favorite examples is St. Pius X. I'm not up to that standard, but he's one of my favorite saints. And he's an example that I'd look on as an example, as teaching me how to lead the life as a priest. But to proclaim somebody, just to reduce such a beautiful thing as the canonization of a saint to a mere idiotic statement, this man is in heaven, is something that's very typical for the present Pope. But it's not impossible, but very typical. In the Conciliar Church, usually things are done on that level. And it's a very, very low, it's a sub-level of theology. But it doesn't mean that because of that, we have no Pope, no infallible beatification or canonization. It just means that we have something that is called vice. We had that before. Alexander VI abused his priestly authority to legitimize his own physical daughter. That is making fun of priesthood. Yet nobody has ever said he wasn't Pope. Nobody has ever even doubted the validity of that legalization of his daughter. It has been accepted in history and by the state in those days. To me, the canonization of the founder of the Opus Dei is a worldwide scandal. But what do you expect from a man who kisses the Quran in public? He kisses the holy book that says you may not drink wine. Such a book cannot be holy.